considering the US national security strategy, as we talked about it before, and China being, the ultimate goal, objective to be targeted by the administration in the United States. Here is what the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States said about China.
Look at the rise of the Chinese military. What our goal in the joint force is to create multiple simultaneous dilemmas for all of the adversaries around the world, so that they are very cautious and concerned about doing something that would bring any sense of threat to the American people.
So he simply, putting all these people together to fight back, by do you see, Matt? I was somehow surprised by these sort of strategies on their part. These are failed strategies, proven failed strategies so far, but they're preaching them, they're advocating for them.
Yeah, these are, I already used the term, but these are the men and women that C. Wright Mills in the 50s called the crackpot realists. These are people who believe in this upside down, completely bizarro world where they don't know, or they don't care, or they're just immune to understanding what has actually happened before, let alone having any degree of strategic empathy or understanding of their adversaries. You see this throughout the American military. Just today, I think it was, maybe it was yesterday, reading comments from the American general in charge of NATO. I forgive me, because several months later, I still can't pronounce his name, Grinch, whatever it is. Yeah. But, saying how it's a certainty, essentially, that if China was to attack Taiwan, which in his language is also certainty, scheduled to occur in 2027, according to these people, that Vladimir Putin will then do something as well. That, in his words, the man who's in charge of NATO, it's already been agreed upon, essentially, or Xi would go to Putin and say, hey, I'm going to attack Taiwan. It'd be good for you to attack Europe. And, while they're off balance, and, and the certainty, again, that they speak about these things, and the way that a guy like General Kane speaks about things, as well as just dressing up, language that you get taught as a lieutenant to make it sound like you're some strategic rock star. This idea of putting the enemy on the horns of a dilemma, you get taught that as a lieutenant in the Marine Corps. You get taught that as a lieutenant in the Army. That's the idea of like using your machine guns to force the enemy into a ditch that you've pre-registered with your mortar fire. Like, give them, if they do one thing, they're going to run into this. If they do another thing, they're going to run into that. That's the idea of presenting a dilemma to the enemy. And so you have these men like Kane, who will present that as if he's some type of modern day Clausewitz, right? Like he's some kind of modern Sun Tzu, and all the sycophants and all those in the media and the pundits, as well as the other officer corps around him, will just marvel at how bright he is, or how insightful he is, or how wise he is, when all they're doing is just repackaging terminology you learn when you're a lieutenant, and then bringing in this certainty about other countries, about other leaders. That's based upon what? There's a really great part of Bob Woodward's book on Obama's decision to escalate the Afghan war in 2009. That book's called Obama's Wars. And in it, General James Jones, who was the commandant of the Marine Corps, but who became Barack Obama's first national security advisor, talks about this certainty that exists within the White House and on the national security staff. And he talks about how, members of both the NSC and of the White House, like the White House chief of staff, will talk about foreign leaders or foreign countries with a degree of certainty. And they've never even met these people before, but they're certain that, the supreme leader is going to act this way, or they're certain that, so and so is going to act this way, or the Chinese Communist Party is going to approve this because they are nefarious and all they desire is insidious. All they're looking to do is to cause big trouble. I mean, like, so there's you see this replication, you see this repeating over and over again within American figures in power. And it's because this is the institution. This is what it produces. Because ultimately, that type of certainty about our adversaries, about other countries in the world, about individual leaders, that type of certainty just feeds the self-interest of the institutions that they represent. And they never get to the top of those institutions unless they are dead set at providing 100% support for those institutions, right? Unless the institutions never allow them to rise, unless these people are going to be of only great benefit to the institutions. And so that's why you see this same type of phenomenon occurring over and over again. So again, whether it's Kane repackaging terminology, I heard as a lieutenant in 1998, at the basic school in Quantico, Virginia, or it's this national security strategy, which, sure, it sounds like there's some method to Trump's madness in the world. But when you pick your head up from the paper after reading it, you realize that, oh, it's just the same old thing. Aircraft carriers off of somebody's coast, sending in drones, seizing other nations' assets, conducting economic warfare against them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Matt, how did you find the situation with Europeans and Ukraine in the document in NSS?
Well, I read mainstream media accounts before I read the document. And so I was actually surprised at how light, well, no, I shouldn't say that. I was actually surprised about how much attention the document gave to Europe and how you could read it in a way where it was supportive in Europe. The press accounts I read before I read the document were hysterical about how this whole purpose of the Trump administration is essentially to stab Europe in the back. Right. I mean, and yes, there were comments in that national security strategy which are bizarre and I think unfounded and ridiculous, such as concern about Europe losing its Western values and it's essentially losing its whiteness is what they're concerned about. I think that's just such nonsense and so ridiculous. But also in that document were testaments to America's commitment to Europe. It's just that the United States cannot provide the resources it once did. So there's a level-headed reasonableness to it. So that I guess, I know I just dumped on the whole thing there before, but there are some aspects to it, I guess, that you could say, hey, compared to his predecessors who wanted to promise, I think the way the document described it as the United States as Ajax with the world on his shoulders, right? I'm not Ajax, Atlas with the world on his shoulders. I don't. I think that's a good description of the United States trying to dominate, trying to be the world's hegemon, not accepting at all that we are now in a multipolar world. So when you read that section on Europe, you see that there is this decision by the United States that it cannot be the world's policeman. It cannot provide the resources, the largesse, the generosity, I think, as a document describes it, as it once did. At the same time, too, it makes clear that Europe's stability is a core American interest. That is a second interest after the hemispheric interest, so ranks above everything else. That actually, now I have to stop a second because maybe Asia was before that, but I can't remember. But it's a core American interest is European stability. And the desire to end the Ukrainian war is framed in a way to stabilize European markets, stabilize European economies, to prevent the war from escalating, and then to bring the United States and Russia back into some type of geopolitical balance, which I don't know how anyone can look at that and say those are bad things, unless you want this war to go on because you believe in this Manichaean battle of good versus evil, that you're still tied into this Cold War belief system of the West is good and the East is bad. So I was surprised that it was so balanced on Europe, particularly after I read the alarmist views that were in the mainstream press about it. I expected it just essentially to be that I expected essentially that they just republished the screed that J.D. Vance, unleashed on the Europeans back in March or so at the Munich Security Conference. I expected it to be that type of harangue, and it wasn't. There were elements of it in there, certainly. Again, I don't agree with those, but the idea that the United States has an interest in Europe certainly well demonstrated in a national security statement. And I think the desire by the Trump administration to achieve a negotiated settlement to end the Ukraine war is, well founded upon those three reasons: to stabilize Europe, prevent the war from escalating, as well as rebalance relations with the United States. And also too, I believe now I'm recalling it, the document does say as well, it's a core interest of the United States to have Ukraine remain a viable nation, which I think, you agree, I agree, most people watching agree. If this war continues, Ukraine will not be a viable nation.
Matt, when you compare, or us, all of us compared, the national security strategy of the United States to the one of the United Kingdom. They have released their national security strategy last year. And the main, issue in that document is internationalism, somehow how to manage the war, how to keep the hegemony of the West. But you see that tone has changed in the new national security strategy of Donald Trump, at least on the paper, the way they're talking about Ukraine, the conflict in Europe, in considering the conflict between the United States, the West, and Russia. Do you think that there is some sort of, difference between Washington and London today in terms of the, this concept of hegemony and the way that they see this sort of hegemony that they want to practice?
Right. I think for those in power in Europe, pretty much in most capitals, few exceptions, but in the Scandinavian countries, in the E3, as they call them, right, in the Low Countries, there is a desire to maintain the status quo. There's a fear that any change is going to be worse for us. I think the European leaders recognize just how weak Europe is, that rather than these last 30 years post-Cold War, where Europe really could have redefined itself with some degree of autonomy from the United States, some degree of independence from the American empire. You make it so that my accusations and others' accusations of Europe being vassal states of the American empire were simply not true or weak, or weak in their evidence. And they chose not to do that. Rather than building up Europe as a technological and education hub, rather than being a center for advanced manufacturing, they did not do that. They decided to be America light. They followed America's ruinous path of financialization that caused deindustrialization, that caused great loss in quality of life for their people, enormous wealth inequality. And, as well as too, going along with the American wars meant millions upon millions of refugees coming into Europe, which caused instability, caused problems. Look, I'm a big believer in migration and immigration and grandson of immigrants. But if your country is unable to accept large numbers of people, regardless of how well your intentions are, there's going to be problems. And so the Europeans are dealing with all that. And I think you have a leadership in Europe that has no other worldview than that which they have come from, the one I just described, that the best thing for us, the way we have hegemony, is to be a part of the American empire and to be the first of the vassals. That is the way that we have our power. That is the way that we are dominant, right? That is the way that we matter. Like, we're sitting with the varsity football players at the lunch table, like that type of relationship. And so the idea of giving up on that and losing that is anathema. It's scary, right? And it's also really dangerous, because what else do we have? And that's why you've seen the fear, that these politicians have of the other parties, not the other parties, but newer or more independent or alternative parties, including far right parties, which is something I certainly don't want to see. I don't want to see far right parties coming to power in the UK or in Germany. So my frustration to Europe, is based on all that. Look at what you all did to yourselves. And as an American, I should not throw stones, of course. But, this idea of Europe in relation to the United States, Europe in relation to the empire, and where they are now, and the fact that what they are holding on to is the legacy, is the remainder of the dying American empire. And so at least the Trump administration has the understanding, has the intellectual honesty. I don't know if they're willing to really act it out or not. I don't think they are. And, as I said before, you look up from the paper and they're acting just the same way as their predecessors did. But, at least they're willing to admit that the United States is no longer the sole superpower. That at least they're willing to admit that the multipolar world is not something that's coming. It's not over the horizon. It's here now. We're living in a multipolar world. And so we have to adapt. We have to reimagine. We have to revisit. We have to recenter. We have to consolidate, however you want to describe it, in order to strengthen ourselves to not just participate in multipolar world, not just to thrive in the multipolar world, but to dominate it, because that's the goal of the American empire, is to maintain its dominance. And the Europeans realize now that that doesn't include them. And so they're really in a bad spot here because of their inaction, because of their desire to choose to remain a vassals of the Americans and reap the spoils of that and go along with the United States. They're now saying, what the hell happened? As the United States says, you know what, Europe, this is not really the way we're going to continue to do things. We understand the importance of Europe, the stability involved in it. It's big. You got nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But our relationship with you is not going to look anywhere the way it has since like 1945.